Thank you, Alicia, for that beautiful music that hits me straight to my core. Thank you again. Can we clap and thank Alicia for her contributions? Good morning, my friends. Please pray with me. God, you are the one who sees us, who hears us, and who strengthens us. Let us see you, hear your words, and be strengthened by your message this morning. Amen. We are continuing through this season of Lent together in this journey of many weeks, learning and exploring the concept of endurance, how this concept interacts with many different aspects of our faith. In this particular week, we are looking at the interaction between endurance and obedience. Now, I can almost feel the collective recoil when I say the word obedience. Very few people actually like that word, obey. No one wants to really think about it. It triggers our defenses and drives us to a particular level of discomfort. And it's no wonder that we have this particular reaction to this word. This word, obey and obedience, it has been used as a cudgel, a weapon of oppression and forced submission for far too long, both outside the church and even within our own walls. It creates feelings of fear, suppression, a stifling of our expression. Look into your mind and really examine what images pop up when you hear the word obedience, when you hear the word obey. Does it inspire feelings and images of freedom and total empowerment? Or does it bring up the phrase, because I said so? Does it conjure images of restriction and control? If you're at all like me, it's that second one. Because I said so, restriction and control. Growing up, what I was constantly told was respect your elders. But we all know that respect your elders really means obey them without question. It was never actually explicitly said, but that was the message that we got. And it didn't take long for me to get the message that when matters of faith, when matters of Christianity, of morality were presented, no questions allowed. This is the way it is. This is the way it has always been. This is the way it always will be. Don't question it. Just do it. This is the truth. This is the only truth. All other perspectives are completely and totally wrong. And beyond that, if they're not just wrong, they may even be inspired by Satan himself. And sadly, we see this perspective not just in smaller communities like mine growing up as a missionary kid, but we see these in the broader church as well. We can even see it within the Methodist Church. Hundreds of churches that have been affiliated with us for 100+ years are disaffiliating. And why is this? It's easy to look at them and think, that's okay, we don't need them. They don't believe what we do. But let's look at that. Isn't that this same concept of because I said so? Of blind obedience? To do what we say without question or face the consequences? And yes, the same is coming from both sides of this issue. Many of those churches refuse to be affiliated with us because we don't believe the way they do. And because we don't believe the same, therefore one of us must be wrong. This idea of obedience one of domineering control, is exactly why we need to look into our own hearts, into our own minds, and have this uncomfortable conversation. Because whether we want to acknowledge it or not, the pain of a restrictive view on obedience destroys families, it destroys churches, it destroys denominations, and it can destroy countries. And like Kirsty has said many times from up here, we are a church of challenge. Our goal is to take what we know, challenge it, and allow ourselves to grow into new and greater life. To push against stagnation in what we believe and open ourselves up to conviction instead of conformity and to truth instead of tradition. And this week we are staring obedience directly in the face, and we are challenging what we have known about this word. Because obedience doesn't have to be stifling and restrictive. Obedience can be liberating, it can be empowering, and it can be transformative. This is the perspective I want us to look at today. Let our eyes see, let our ears hear, and let our minds explore. A new understanding of obedience, one where we enter into a deeper relationship with God and with each other, and where we are empowered to live and act out our faith with conviction and courage. The pain, though, of blind obedience can hit us very hard, even when we think we're trying to avoid it. Because we are constantly told what the right thing to do is. We have been told this from the moment we started growing up, from the moment we could understand words. We are told, this is the right thing to do that, and don't do anything else. Our parents, our teachers, our pastors, our politicians, it invades every aspect of our lives, and it invades every minute of our day. Park here, but not there. Drive here, but not there. You can eat here, you can't eat there. Talk now, don't talk then. It's a very structured, restrictive way of living. And it can get exhausting to manage all these standards and expectations. And for what? To make sure that somebody else feels good or comfortable? It can get heavy, wearisome, burdensome to bear the responsibility of a host of arbitrary rules just to survive or to minorly progress through our life. This level of pressure destroyed me. I grew up as a missionary kid. I grew up learning this stuff. And I grew up in a very highly theologically restrictive environment. I was told, this is what we believe. You are going to be told what we believe, and you are going to accept that as what we believe without question. I had to adhere to those specific set of rules so that I could be a good role model as the oldest missionary kid in my family. So that I could be a good role model, a good son, so that I could shed a positive light on my parents' ministry. It was a very heavy burden. It wasn't one that I sought out. It was one that was shoved on me from birth. And it grew heavier and heavier year after year until it finally crushed me. In December of 2011, I moved here to Nebraska. I had been living in Washington for a few years before that, but everything kind of collapsed around me up there in Washington. By the end of 2011, I ended up homeless, broke, jobless, loveless, with zero expectations of anything changing. The only thing I could do was move back in with my parents at the age of 22 with no hope for the future. Now, I had tried my entire life to follow all these rules that had been set up for me. I was a dutiful son. I was a dutiful churchgoer. I tried to follow all the rules because this is what they said I needed to do. So why hadn't I succeeded? Where was my reward? Why had everything been taken away from me? the prescriptive nature of this old view of obedience had given me a framework of do this, get that. But it had not given me any framework to actually grow from. As a result, when I was hit with heavy trials and heavy tribulations, I didn't know what to do. And much like a dry stick, it snaps. It wasn't. What had happened to me was not in any of the content that had been presented to me. It wasn't anything I was prepared for. And when it all happened, it destroyed me. And to be fully honest, I left my faith at that point. I abandoned God at that point. I stepped away from the church. I stepped away from everything I had believed. Because what good was it doing me? I had had enough. If I was doing everything right and following all the rules and it still wasn't going to help, what good was it and what is actually going to help? So I stopped going to church, I stopped interacting with the faith, and it stayed that way for a year and a half. I didn't know how to grow, I didn't know how to bend, I didn't know how to adjust or adapt. We all need trials to grow, but we need to know how to grow. Without the freedom to learn, trials will simply crush us. They'll leave us with no hope and with a deep desire to make sure that things can never change again. So then 10, 20, 30 years down the road, some new, fresh thing comes into play and starts proposing what feels like radical ideas. Radical ideas like the fact that maybe, we do still struggle with some of these isms. Radical ideas like maybe letting some other people into the building to use it when we're not. And when you've learned to be truly and purely rigid in your thinking, it feels like an attack. It feels like an attack. Like someone is trying to introduce danger into the church, like they aren't considering the safety and the well-being of the church by doing something new. Like they aren't accepting the great and heavy burden of running the church according to all the rules. Now, I can appreciate the desire to follow the rules. I love rules. I love structure. I am a perfectionist. I want things to be just so. So when I'm working on this sermon and I'm up until 1:30 in the morning making more and more edits because it's not exactly the way I think it should be, I can feel some of the stress. An attack on the rules, an attack on the structure can feel like an attack on the faith itself. Look at the grain of wheat in the gospel reading that we had today. The grain of wheat knows one thing. It's a grain of wheat. It sits on the stalk. That's what it does. But one day, it starts to feel something changing. The stalk is changing. The weather's changing. It's starting to fall. It's starting to move away from the stalk. It doesn't know what is going on. It's terrifying. What is that grain of wheat supposed to do? What are you supposed to do when you feel everything around you changing? You know the stalk. You love the stalk. You want to be with the stalk, and you don't want anything to change, but yet life is changing. Now, you can strain against the flow of nature and do your absolute darndest to stay attached to that stalk as long as you can. But try as hard as you want, things still change. And the world changes. Now, as that grain of wheat, you have an option. Continue on with the heavy burdens, the rigid rules, regulations, following without questions, the adherence to tradition. It's familiar, but the longer we go on, the more tradition gets added on, the more rules get created, and the heavier the burden becomes. Or do we go with option 2, what Jesus presents to us, taking his light burden, Jesus' easy yoke? It's a burden that frees us from the weight of tradition and from expectations, from the outdated rules, and provides us the freedom to ask questions and discover. Is it scary? Yeah, it can be, because you don't know what's going to happen next. You don't have the security of knowing that everything has to follow the rules so you know what to expect. But this is where we learn, and this is where we start to grow. I want to take a look at this word obedience again. What does the dictionary have to say about it? When you look it up, you have to follow quite a few things because dictionaries are weird like that. You look up, what does obedience mean? Oh, it's a state of obeying. Okay, what's obeying mean? It means a state of obeying. I'm like, okay, what does obey mean? You got to dig down a little bit. But when you look into it and you find out what it's actually talking about, the dictionary defines it as to comply or conform with, or to follow the commands or the guidance of. Now, why would someone want to conform, comply, or follow the commands or guidance of anyone or anything? A couple of years ago, I noticed that my dryer started acting strangely at home. I would put the clothes in, turn it on. Hour later, come back, the clothes are still wet. They're slightly warm, but they're still wet. It would go 3 or 4 cycles. I set it for 3 or 4 different cycles, and the clothes were still wet. And then I noticed that the clothes on top were starting to melt. I'm like, what in the world is going on? So I finally took the time to stop and start the dryer, watch it, and do that thing where you open up the door really fast to see if anything's happening. Turns out the drum wasn't spinning. So all the clothes are just sitting there with hot air blowing over the top of them. Now, I don't know the first thing about home appliances. I'm not an appliance repair technician. When it came to that dryer, I couldn't even tell you how to fix that big foil tube on the back if it popped off the back of the dryer. And now here I was panicking because my dryer wasn't spinning like dryers do anymore. And I was faced with a choice. A choice of the heavy burden of self-blame, resignation, and heavy spending to go get a new dryer, or a light burden of exploring and looking and seeing what's going on. I could have followed my first thought, that of traditional obedience, blind obedience. I could have just said I was a failure for not maintaining it correctly and then just dished out the hundreds of dollars to replace it. On the other hand, there was a glimmer of hope, a voice urging me to ask questions, to seek understanding, and to challenge what my brain told me at first. So at that moment, I decided to move away from accepting defeat. And I turned to my closest friend in times of uncertainty, Google. Through some simple searches, some quick questions typed in the search bar, some questions that I allowed myself to ask, I found a video of my particular dryer with a guy very kindly explaining how to take it apart, how to look at it, how to figure out what's going on, and how to fix it. What had started as a heavy and wearisome burden, a broken dryer, became a light and enriching burden as I learned how my dryer functioned, what causes issues like this, and finally, that I did not actually have to pay hundreds of dollars to replace the thing. I just needed to put a new belt on the drum. True obedience isn't just about blindly following rules, expectations, and the things that you knew in the past. It's about constantly learning, growing, and adapting. It's about embracing a posture of humility and curiosity, recognizing that we don't all have all the answers, but being open to seeking them out and finding them. Those who cling to the attachments of the past, to the heavy burdens of tradition, will eventually lose their grasp on life. But those who are willing to let go of that old life, to hate the blind attachment to tradition, those who are willing to let it go, to embrace the newness of life, and to embrace the opportunities for growth it will bring, will find true fulfillment and true abundance. However, we must acknowledge that doing this, traversing into this unknown area, does come with a level of uncertainty, because we don't know what's going to happen. We aren't in full control like we want to be. And this is where Jesus invites us to take his yoke, providing us and promising us rest and a lighter burden. Note, he does not promise a life completely devoid of challenge. It is not a promise of a life free from discomfort or stress. Because growth and learning do not happen without discomfort, without stress, without challenge. No pain, no gain, as the saying goes. This is where endurance plays its key and critical part. Endurance, the idea of standing against an onslaught of pain and discomfort, of pushing through the pain and discomfort to find the light at the end of the tunnel. Enduring the uncertainty and discomfort of embracing this new life is where true growth and transformation occur. That single grain of wheat needs to fall into uncertainty, into some level of darkness in order to ultimately bear fruit. Remember from before how I said I completely left the faith after moving to Nebraska? Opening myself up to the idea of a learning obedience is what brought me back. I had decided after leaving that I was going to keep reading, keep looking, just to see what's out there. Maybe there was a new tradition that fit better for what I needed. And through my readings, I found a core concept in the writings of an avowed atheist, of all people. The concept that humans are created, are imbued with the goodness of creation, with the inherent worth and value of creation. Because goodness has to come from somewhere. So it must come from the origin of all things. What this means is that no one, no matter what, can give you any rules that can take away your inherent goodness. There are no rules that can wipe away the image of God from your soul. That was a mind-blowing moment for me, because the rules that I had known were the ones that had betrayed me, the ones that made me feel like I had everything wiped away, that I was worth nothing, the ones that had crushed my life. But this realization not only encouraged me, it was a reminder that God did, in fact, create me in God's image. He did put the imago Dei inside of me, the essence of God in the very core of my being. And it provides a solid base for learning and for growing. That same author taught that growth is absolutely necessary for life. It was a very simple concept, a very obvious concept, but I had never seen it portrayed in this way. What she said is, life needs growth. If it does not grow, it's dead. That's how we tell if a plant is dead. Is it growing? Yeah, okay, it's alive. Is it not growing? No, then it's probably dead. If something doesn't grow at all, it's pretty much just dead. And growth is a constant process, a continual journey, a journey of learning that requires endurance. the endurance to release our stranglehold on the rules, on the tradition, the endurance to accept that we don't have the control that we thought we did, the endurance to let Jesus handle the things that we can't handle, and the endurance to continue seeking more opportunities to learn and grow, knowing that this journey will never stop. Now, we have two perspectives on obedience that I've presented this morning. One, strict adherence to the familiar in order to control, hold secure, and prevent unknown and unwanted change. Or, doing what we are called to do, to learn and grow, even while uncomfortable, knowing that Jesus has all the heavy stuff taken care of already. Which one of those sounds more inviting? Which one sounds more encouraging? Which one sounds like a healthy, emotionally stable parent? By enduring learning, we are participating in God's transformative work in the world. By enduring with obedience, we learn how God's work is transforming the world and how we can use our prayers, our presence, our gifts, our service, and our witness in order to join this transformation. By enduring with obedience, we submit ourselves to God in the same way that Jesus submitted himself to the unknown as he stepped into the desert to grow, as the season of Lent reminds us. This new obedience, this idea of a learning obedience, is not just a one-time decision, though, but a continual surrendering of our will to God's, even when we enter unfamiliar territory. But why? Because God said so? No. Because we have seen that Jesus has gone through the same struggles that we have. Jesus has experienced the same betrayal of the rules that we have. We see that Jesus learned and that he grew. We see that he endured even death and was still brought back. And we accept that maybe he knows a little bit more than we do. That maybe he's a little bit wiser than we are. And that we can learn from him. Obedience is not simply following the rules. It's learning from the best so that we can be better, so that we can make the world a better place. After all, we do know that working together, the best is truly yet to come. Thanks be to God.